As the U.S. is approaching its default in June, the fight over the debt ceiling has grasped the world's attention. While we are seeing House Speaker Keven McCarthy clapping with a victorious smile and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer celebrating an agreement by senators, will the 99-page bill passed by Congress eventually solve the U.S. debt problem? Or is the debt crisis a ticking time bomb that's just been postponed? I'm Saina. Welcome to Facts Tell. The bill suspended the federal government's $31.4 trillion debt ceiling, allowing it to borrow more money until after the next presidential election in November 2024. Although this agreement sort of ended the months-long deadlock, there was no celebration while announcing it, which reflected the bitter tone of the negotiations before America runs out of money to pay its debts. And whether this bill can pass through Congress or not can't really solve the fundamental problems, as the U.S. debt crisis is much more complicated. Apart from reaching a debt ceiling agreement, the U.S. government still has a cash flow problem, and the agreement is only the first step in saving the government from the brink of illiquidity. And guess what? The Democrats paid a high price to extend the debt ceiling by 2 years, which will be felt for the next decade by the American people and their economy.
Rescinded COVID relief funds, about $30 billion that have already been approved but now allocated, will now go back to the budget. And there is concern there because, of course, those COVID relief funds were not only to address the emergency portion of the pandemic, which is now over, but to help many struggling Americans who found themselves in a tough spot because of the pandemic.
To understand the complexity of the debt ceiling problem, you need to understand the working model of the U.S. Treasury.
The U.S. Treasury uses tax revenue and debt to pay the country's bills, like funding government programs, Social Security, and paying interest on existing debt. If it runs out of money and isn't able to pay these investors back, that's default.
So, what the Democrat-controlled White House and House Republicans are fighting over, whether to raise or cap America's debt limit, is essentially about how much the U.S. government can borrow to pay its bills. You do not hear me wrong. The U.S. Treasury borrows money to make ends meet for the past 2 decades. Since 2001, the U.S. government has been running an annual deficit. Usually, that isn't a problem, but it does mean a large amount of the government spending is from credit. According to the U.S. Constitution, any borrowing must first be approved by Congress, and the debt ceiling has been a marker for how much the government can borrow since 1917. The debt limit was created to give the Treasury autonomy regarding borrowing, originally making it easier to finance mobilization efforts in World War I, and later simplifying the government's financing. But as the U.S. got itself involved in more and more wars abroad, it has to accumulate more debt as well. Since 1960, Congress has raised the debt limit 78 times. In the last 2 decades, the U.S. has added $25 trillion in debt in regards to finance wars, tax cuts, emergency responses, and expanded federal spending. And now, the U.S. is a developed country with the 4th highest debt burden. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is as large as 144%, exceeding only by Japan, Italy, and Greece, followed by Spain. And over time, this ballooned national debt met another challenge on Capitol Hill. In 2011, the debt ceiling was effectively weaponized as the Republican-controlled House played hardball with the Democrats in the White House and Senate over the debt limit issue. And this year, as the U.S. hit the debt ceiling in January, a near carbon copy standoff is playing out as House Republicans argue for sweeping spending cuts.
But this year's fight is turning out to be a lot more messy than previous years. And since this debt ceiling is one of the few must-pass pieces of legislation, both parties have tried to use this issue as an opportunity to take a political stand and exact concessions to cut back on government spending.
But the risk for whatever doing is prohibitive. The exact timing of the default date, which is so-called X date, is unknown. It could be any time between early June and early August. That's why Republicans are accused of playing with fire. And This is the fight politicians are playing.
Now, so what happens if the debt ceiling is not raised? Well, a default occurs. U.S. debt is considered the bedrock of the global financial system, partly due to its stability. And so a default could shake economies around the world. Stock and bond markets would likely plunge as investors question the value of U.S. treasuries, which are seen as among the safest investments and key to the world's financial system. The U.S. could fall into recession and many Americans would lose their jobs.
So, upheaval in the global economy, plunging stocks and bonds, the once safest investments and the bedrock of the global financial system on the brink of collapsing just because raising the debt limit has become an increasingly political issue on Capitol Hill, and power in Washington is divided more than ever. At the end of the day, it's always ordinary people who bear the hardest brunt.
The point is that America has incurred all of these debts because of all of its ongoing obligations, whether to paying government salaries or to paying retired pensioners their Social Security payments, to paying for health insurance, to paying for ongoing government programs. If they don't increase the debt ceiling, the government will not be able to make those spending obligations.
The checks many retirees rely on in the U.S. could be delayed or temporarily reduced, yet people need this money to pay their bills. Rent, utilities, out-of-pocket medical expenses, and groceries. Pension payments could even be suspended or withheld. The pay of soldiers and federal workers could be cut. And it's not just people living in the U.S. In 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. from AAA to AA+ due to the stalemate over the debt ceiling. The S&P 500 index of leading U.S. shares plunged more than 15% and kept falling even after a deal was reached, which happened just hours before the government ran out of funds. And not just the U.S. stock market fell sharply. The market panic quickly spread to the global stock market, like dominoes. As a result, the Shanghai Composite Index, the FTSE 100 Index in London, the DAX Index in Frankfurt, the CAC 40 Index in Paris, the Nikkei 225 Index, and the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong all plunged. And the global financial market continued to be in turmoil for weeks. As recent reportings back in 2011, this was on the day of August 8, 2011, as the loss of America's top credit rating fueled the concern of the global economy. China's stock plunged, dragging the benchmark index down 20% from a November high. Fears of a new financial crisis and concerns about the health of the U.S. economy sent the shares prices tumbling in Europe and also led to further declines in Asia, even in early September. For example, the Royal Bank of Scotland gave up more than 12%, while Barclays, Deutsche Bank, and BNP Paribas each fell more than 6% during early September. So, no wonder people like to describe a U.S. debt default as the mother of all crises, since its spillover can ricochet around the world. And behind all these numbers and indexes, we are talking about millions and millions of families around the globe. In the UK, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in China, in Japan, in Thailand. Yet the standoff over the debt ceiling has now turned into a game of chicken. In the current version, the Biden administration and congressional Republicans each want the other to blink first and avoid a horrific default on federal government debt. The welfare of American households and individuals become the handy bargaining chips of the politicians on Capitol Hill, who are even willing to hold the world economy hostage to make their political stance.
We do need to raise the debt ceiling to avoid economic calamity.
So, let's just hope the U.S. debt crisis ticking time bomb will never explode. The economic calamity that Ms. Yellen is talking about will never happen, and there won't be another financial crisis when politicians in Washington eventually blink. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you like our show, please remember to click like and subscribe. I'm Sina. See you next time.